Well, hey guys. Rachel and I are here to talk about postmodernism, which is alternatively titled The Death of Truth. So, first, what is postmodernism? An overview. When God dies, both the substance and value of everything else dies too. So, the tricky thing with postmodernism is defining what it is because it kind of isn't anything. But I will try to tell you what it is. So, the first thing that it is an incredulity toward meta narratives, or the pressing into of fragmented realities. And what that basically means is that we all have different stories. And postmodernism doesn't like that we obey one meta narrative or one large story, such as Christianity does by adhering to the story of Christianity. It prefers to adhere to all stories. So the story of Christianity and the story of Islam and the story of Judaism and the story of Hinduism, etc. That all of them are valid. So with postmodernism, Frederick, oh gosh, I can't say his last name. I apologize for my terrible German with my German last name, but it's Nietzsche, I think. But he once wrote of God, "We have killed him. You and I, we are his murderers." So when God dies, both the substance and value of everything else die too. But a culture cannot lose its philosophic center without the most serious of consequences, which we will see throughout this presentation on postmodernism. It changes who we are and who we believe ourselves to be. However, to the postmodernist, the acknowledgement of the death of God is the beginning of wisdom. But as our lovely James Sire points out, postmodernism is not post anything, but merely the last move of the modern. It contains many stories, which are not more valid than the other. Our age finds itself afloat in a pluralism of perspectives, a plethora of philosophical possibilities, but with no dominant notion of where to go or how to get there. You can find that quote on page 215 of our book. Defining a worldview without a center means the whole thing is fuzzy. So the issue is, what does postmodernism actually preach? That everything is true. There are no overarching truths. There are just tiny truths that you believe. What's true for you isn't true for me. So to introduce postmodernism, Rachel is going to talk about being to knowing to meaning.
Hey, so being to knowing to meaning, it really is it's a shift in first things. And so before we even get into the questions that Sire has talked about throughout the rest of the book, the 8 different worldview points, postmodernism begs a first question, and it is a worldview question about worldview questions. And he says, quote, "The first question postmodernism addresses is not what is there or how we know what is there, but how language functions to construct meaning." In other words, there's been a shift in first things, from being to knowing to construct meaning, end quote. So this is also where we first see this obsession almost with language. There's this desire, or this desire to have language determine everything. And so we see that throughout the whole explanation of the worldview, even though it's barely a worldview in itself. So we see that there's 2 major shifts. And the first is theism to naturalism, which is pre-modernism to modernism, and then modernism to postmodernism. And so throughout this chapter, Sire takes these 2 shifts to kind of explain each of the points, because it's really important that we know that, as Sydney had already pointed out, postmodernism is merely a continuation of modernism. And so if we want to know where the postmodernists are getting their view, we have to know where they're coming from, where they're shifting from. And so first we have the shift 1, which is theism to naturalism. And so this is a taking away of the divine, which we've already learned about in naturalism, and it's making everything physical, a closed universe where everything that can be understood can also be seen. It is this, I think, therefore I am. And so instead of I am because God created me to be who I am, it is I think there's reason, and that is what determines who I am. It's existence before essence. This is the first major shift, which gets us to naturalism. But then naturalism is shifted to postmodernism by a different means. And so it takes us knowing is not enough to determine who we are, that we are just creatures who think, but what do we perceive about that thinking? What meaning are we putting to that thinking? And that is what determines our being. So our being is not just what we see or observe or think, but our being is the meaning to which we put that knowledge. So what we think gives us our meaning. So if you want to switch the slides. So we have our 8 questions, and these will, in some sense, address in certain ways. But first, it's good to know that the first 2 worldview questions 1 and 2, is answered through naturalism. So all that is there is the closed universe. That's postmodernism sticks to that belief, and that nothing from outside of the closed universe can influence. And so we're dealing with things that can be seen or exist. And so that does give us a starting point as we begin to go through the rest of the questions. And so just as overview, since we won't fully address these directly, but it just as a reminder of the things that postmodernism is addressing is the nature of human beings in question 3, 4, humans' destiny, 5, how can we know, 6, ethics, 7, historical significance, and then 8 is their core commitment. And so now Sydney is going to talk about language, or the death of truth.
Yeah, so the first question that Sire actually answers in this worldview is question number 5, and it's how do we know anything at all? And according to the postmodernist, the truth about reality itself is forever hidden from us, and the only thing we can do is tell stories. The language we use to tell our stories is, quote, a mobile army of metaphors. We cannot have meaning, but for all the stories we are more, I am so sorry. I'm going to start the sentence over. We can't know anything. The language we use to tell our stories is a mobile army of metaphors. We can't have meaning, for all the stories are more or less meaningful, but we can't have truth. Not truthfulness, just usefulness. So the issue with postmodernism is we have ultimately killed truth. We have no ability to know anything true. No person has a truer story, but we have many stories that elicit helpful and useful responses. And so for postmodernism, the biggest thing that we have to focus on is language, because by us speaking, that is the only way we know anything. So what is language? Language is that which we impose upon reality. Apart from our linguistic systems, we know nothing. We create language, the world does not give us one to speak. Only we do. It causes us to hold beliefs, but only when we have a language to name things within that reality. Language is made rather than found. So how can we know that things are true if we made up the language to define those things in the first place? Truth is whatever our community can agree on and use common language to name and decipher. So things like there's a bus coming down a street. It's useful, but how do we know that? It's because I assigned words to the thing that is happening in front of me. Our language is completely human. So what happens then? We tell a lot of stories, and our narratives determine our community. And this answers question number 3. What is humanity about? Stories give communities their cohesive character. Our stories, our truths bind communities together. Communities fall apart when people within them begin to believe different stories. For example, a few years ago, we saw the fracturing of the Presbyterian Church over LGBTQ rights. Their narratives regarding this topic split their community. However, according to postmodernism, it doesn't matter so long as they found people who agreed and formed new groups with their truths. So then we shift into this idea that stories and language have social power. So language is power, or what do we care what we say anyway? How do we know anything or right from wrong? One narrative used as a meta narrative is oppressive, according to the postmodernist. Christianity, for example, sends certain people to hell. That's exclusionary. This entire concept answers worldview questions 5 and 6. All narratives mask a play for power. Any one narrative used as a meta narrative is oppressive. Stories give power to the storyteller. If we are to believe one story has more power than another, that is not an equal distribution of power. Humans are what they define themselves as by the languages they use. And yes, this is somewhat true. The things I say about myself, the way I define myself, becomes true. We are what we do, right? Or is this what our postmodern society has trained us to believe? What have you defined yourself by? Are these more actions or beings? Postmodernism has turned us into human doings, and we get this in what is how we can be good without God. So we define ourselves by the language we use. So I challenge you to list the things that you've defined yourself as, how you explain who you are. Because if you're explaining yourself by what you do, postmodernism says, good on you, because that's the only way we can know ourselves. Truth is what we make of it. It follows from naturalism and existentialism, but with this linguistic twist. This gives us just extreme moral relativism. The greatest good, it seems, is an individual's freedom to maximize one's own pleasure. So how do we determine what's right in this? Social good seems to be whatever society deems it to be. So if a future society deems fascism to be desirable, liberal Democrats are without appeal. And we're seeing this play out in real time. The law has seemed to be the enemy, and the social structure is tipping because we don't have a moral structure to hang on to, because we have lost our philosophical center. No one really knows what's right anymore. Turn on the news. We're not sure what to define anything as anymore, and we're not sure who is right. Morality is the multiplicity of languages used to distinguish right from wrong to the postmodernist, which means evidently nothing can be right or wrong. And so next, Rachel's going to talk a bit about postmodernism's cutting edge.
So postmodernism's cutting edge answers questions 7 and 8, which is historical significance and a core commitment. And so postmodernism, it says, quote, is in the flux, as is postmodernism's take on significance of human history, including its own history. This means that the core commitment of many postmodernists are in a flux as well, end quote. So their history is fluid. And as Sydney was saying, everything is only has meaning because we give it meaning. And because nothing can really be true unless it's true for you, then history is the same way. There's no objective reality. And so historical events are this fluid line of stories that we take and we give meaning, applying them to ourselves. This is also we see in theology, which is why postmodernism does have an impact on even theism, because they take stories from the Bible and say, yes, these are good stories and we can glean great meaning from them, but that doesn't make them true. It doesn't make them historically accurate or something that actually happened. And this goes true for all of history. This also influences their core commitments. And so if their core commitment today may have be a different core commitment tomorrow. Yesterday's story has new meaning today, and so is the core commitment. And so as we move into this panoramic sweep, it has swept through so much of our world and our different sciences. So just to name a few, history, which we've just briefly discussed, and theology, but also science. And this one is a little bit harder to fully infiltrate. Many scientists have seen the absurdity in postmodernism as a means to determine objective reality, because you can't deny what you're seeing, and it's not that I'm seeing something different than you are. But they have tried. And so scientists, even some scientists, have actually published pseudo works with the name of postmodernism, and have gotten published into some reliable journals because of this acceptance of absurdity. And so it was made, these publications were made sort of as a joke to prove how absurd postmodernism is, but it just goes to show how much it is affecting all arenas of our world. Postmodernism has not yet had its last word, so that is its biggest risk. And so, and so now we're going to go to the critique. So Sire, as with many of the other worldviews, has had his own critique. And what we found comical was that though he tried to find some positives in postmodernism, he ended every positive with how it wasn't really positive. And so I will show those to you now. So first, he says there's too much confidence has been placed in human reason. And so he appreciates postmodernism's question of the naturalists to say, everything that can be seen is not everything that can be known. And so he appreciates this question, but they also don't give the Bible any narrative authority, which also is a problem, because if you put because there is a faith factor in that, and they deny all of that. And so and then also language is often associated with power, which is he does appreciate, because there is power in language. And we see this with politics, and even we just watched our documentary, So Merchants of Doubt. They use this power of language, this power of doubt, to affect a whole country of what they believed, and to knock down what was actually truth, which is science. So language is powerful, but the contradiction is in this is that that postmodernists are actually using language to say language is powerful, or language is a power struggle, or what is a means to use power, is a means to control. And so it's kind of contradictory to say that that you can not trust any language. The second is, so they're negative. So the negative critiques on this is the attention to social constructs is important, but it is also self-refuting. So this is kind of what was already said, that it is good to note the power of social constructs, but noting its power is in and of itself a social construct. And then a critique of the sufficiency of human reason rests on the sufficiency of human reason. And so they're saying that we can't really know anything that we think, and that anything someone says is up for interpretation, yet they're using reason, they're using language to explain these things. So how could we even trust the language that they're using? So these are just a few of the critiques that that postmodernism has. And also one other one that I thought was interesting was they reject all meta-narratives, but when you reject a meta-narrative, that in of itself is a meta-narrative. So there's just a lot of contradictions in this worldview.
Yeah. So where do we go from here is the big question of the day. And the first thing we need to start with is spirituality in a postmodern world. A lot of people have been very okay with doing away with God. However, others replace God with themselves. So this is either like an atheist or agnostic worldview. But one thing that's really important that I really liked from Sire was that he noted that postmodern scholar Ihab Hassan encourages vague spirituality. So he said, "This I know. Without spirit, the sense of cosmic wonder, of being and morality at the widest edge, which we all share existence, quickly reduces to mere survival." So he basically says that without some kind of spirituality, we have nothing to live for, which is true. Without a future to hope for, there's no point in living. However, postmodernism also has its issues. A few scholars have considered a couple possible outcomes to the challenge to postmodernism, saying that it could lead to mysticism and dogmatism and religious fundamentalism. Second, that intellectuals will become reluctant to critique existing social order. And it could also emerge with a politically progressive but not sectarian society, a not dogmatic, but rationalistic society, an open-minded but not frivolous society, basically one that is rational. However, these scholars also note that this is more of a dream and not a reality, because postmodernism doesn't really encourage rational thought. It encourages thinking whatever you want to think. So although it does encourage some amount of spirituality, it really doesn't, because that would be thinking of something outside of yourself. And postmodernism really could very easily lead into anarchy, because it does say what's true for you is not true for me. And so how can we determine any higher moral ground? How can we determine a moral standard that we make laws by? Because maybe a law that's good for you is not good for me, etc. Which leads into just power grabs based on language and based on who has the best definitions of things we see. So what happens now? Sire notes that postmodernism is really just the most recent phase of the modern, which Rachel said earlier. It draws a lot from modernism. So, as Sire says, we must take postmodernism for what it is, and then we reach back to what it has destroyed and start anew. In a postmodern society, we can't live, because without any definition of moral high ground, we have nothing to measure ourselves up against. And in studying this, it reminded me of a story a friend told me recently because of her students moving into the online space. She said that a lot of her kids, she's a third grade teacher, a lot of her kids don't have structure at home, and they yearn for structure in the classroom. And that's why they do so well at school. But now that they're home, they have no structure and are still expected to live within those rule-based systems. So really what this shows is that postmodernism doesn't allow for any structure, and we as humans actually do desire structure. And with that, we can't live in a postmodern society. So where do we go from here? We need a worldview that answers all 8 questions, and we need a worldview that says there is a bound. So at the end of the day, postmodernism doesn't work. And we have, I think, demonstrated why. So thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention. And I hope this has led you to do what these philosophers have said: examine your life and see what is outside of it. Thank you, guys.